From owning slaves in their hundreds to failed response during national crises to unintentionally and intentionally starting wars in other countries, every single US president has done something terrible while they were in power. Today we're looking at one bad thing about every president of the United States of America that ever lived. As the first ever president of the United States of America, George Washington had a bit of a standard to set for his successors. And while he was generally an upright man of integrity, he still had his flaws. So what bad thing did such a stellar president do? Well, for his time, this wasn't seen as such a bad thing. But to us modern day people, it's the absolute worst. Washington had a weird relationship with the topic of slavery. In the midst of friends and close family, he would wish for its abolition, but in public, he wouldn't be as vocal. Although he eventually stopped buying slaves and even wrote in his will that the ones he owned be freed upon his wife's death, a certain law he passed made this noble act mean nothing. In 1793, George Washington authorized the capture and return of runaway enslaved people to their owners, even the slaves who escaped to free states. This law also imposed a fine of $500 on anyone who helped or harbored an escaped slave. $500 in 1793 is not $500 in 2025. That was a hefty fine in that time, and this law he passed would forever remain a stain on Washington's legacy. It's sad because he genuinely wanted slavery to end, but when it came down to it, he caved to the demands of officials and high-ranking people of American society who benefited the most from slavery. Moving on to the second president of the United States of America, whose greatest flaw was trying to escape criticism by stopping free speech. The Sedition Act of 1798, signed into law by President John Adams, marked a deeply controversial moment in early American politics, exposing the fragility of free speech and intensifying divisions between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The act, which was part of a broader set of laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, criminalized the publication of false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the US government or its officials, effectively allowing the prosecution of critics of the Adams administration. Federalists, who controlled Congress and the presidency, justified the law as a wartime measure amid tensions with France, arguing it was necessary to prevent subversion and maintain national security. However, Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, denounced it as an unconstitutional assault on the First Amendment, designed to silence opposition newspapers and suppress dissent. Under the act, over 20 individuals, primarily Republican-leaning editors and politicians, were arrested and prosecuted, including Congressman Matthew Lyon, who was jailed for criticizing Adams' unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp. However, we can't take Thomas Jefferson's sense of justice seriously because even he had massive flaws in his character. As the third president of America, as well as John Adams' successor and biggest critic, Jefferson had to do better than his predecessor. But there was one place he failed in and solidified himself as a hypocrite, just like Adams. Thomas Jefferson, as a principal author of the Declaration of Independence, embodied a profound contradiction between his ideals of liberty and his personal and political entanglement with slavery, a problem that has cast a long shadow over his legacy. Despite famously declaring that all men are created equal, Jefferson owned more than 600 slaves throughout his lifetime and fathered children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman, a relationship that was later confirmed by DNA evidence. His 1800 presidential campaign was marked by vicious radical fear-mongering, with Federalists attacking him as a dangerous radical who would incite slave rebellions, while Jefferson himself argued that emancipation would require the removal of black people from America, reflecting his belief in white superiority. As president, Jefferson signed legislation in 1807 to ban the international slave trade, yet he did so not out of moral opposition to slavery but as a political compromise, and he continued to profit from enslaved labor at Monticello. His post-presidency writings further revealed his racist pseudoscientific theories, including claims that black people were biologically inferior to whites. This hypocrisy of preaching freedom in the nation's founding documents while perpetrating racial subjugation has made Jefferson a central figure in America's reckoning with its racist origins. Recent historians have exposed the full extent of Jefferson's exploitation of enslaved people, transforming his image from an enlightened statesman into a symbol of the nation's unresolved contradictions. The issue of Jefferson's racism and slavery remains a defining controversy, challenging the myth of the Founding Fathers as unwavering champions of universal freedom. And just like Jefferson, this next president had a lot to say about James Adams, but he had absolutely no right to. As the fourth president of the United States, James Madison and his Democratic-Republican allies aggressively pushed for the War of 1812, a conflict that became one of the earliest examples of a wag the dog scenario in American political history. This means that it was a war pursued in part to secure re-election rather than out of strategic necessity. As he faced declining popularity and the prospect of a one-term presidency like his predecessor John Adams, Madison yielded to the war hawks in Congress, who demanded confrontation with Britain over maritime grievances and territorial expansion. The decision proved disastrous. The US military, woefully unprepared, suffered humiliating defeats, including the burning of Washington by British forces, while the conflict claimed some 15,000 lives and drained $105 million from an already strained treasury. Unlike Adams, who had resisted war fever with France in 1798 despite its political risks, Madison lacked both the diplomatic experience and the executive decisiveness to manage the crisis effectively. His provincial worldview, having never traveled abroad, left him ill-equipped to navigate the complexities of international power struggles, a stark contrast to contemporaries like James Monroe, whose military and diplomatic background might have averted some of the war's worst blunders. Though late victories at New Orleans and Lake Champlain salvaged national pride, Madison's legacy remains shadowed by the war's avoidable toll, a reminder that even the most revered founders were flawed leaders, capable of miscalculation and political self-interest. While James Madison mishandled situations and led to a war, his successor mismanaged things financially and led America into a 4-year economic recession. During the tenure of the fifth president of America, James Monroe, the Panic of 1819, the first major peacetime financial crisis in US history, unfolded. This incident exposed his administration's lack of effective economic oversight. A speculative land bubble, fueled by reckless lending from state banks and the unchecked expansion of credit, collapsed disastrously, leading to widespread bankruptcies, foreclosures, and unemployment. Monroe, adhering to a largely hands-off approach, failed to intervene as the Second Bank of the United States tightened credit abruptly, worsening the Depression. His reluctance to address the crisis with federal measures highlighted a broader flaw in his leadership, an unwavering commitment to limit government even in the face of national economic disaster. The panic left lasting scars on the American economy and revealed Monroe's inability to adapt his Jeffersonian principles to the complexities of a rapidly modernizing financial system. So far, we've seen presidents who made costly mistakes while they were in office, but this next one was corrupt from the very beginning. And just like his father John Adams, he tried to manipulate things to favor him. The election of 1824, which made John Quincy Adams the sixth president of the USA, was marred by accusations of a corrupt bargain that tainted his administration from its inception. When no candidate secured an electoral college majority, the decision fell to the House of Representatives, where Adams struck a backroom deal with Henry Clay, his rival and Speaker of the House. Clay, who had thrown his support behind Adams, was subsequently appointed Secretary of State, a move widely interpreted as a quid pro quo. The scandal fueled public outrage, with Andrew Jackson's supporters denouncing the election as undemocratic and illegitimate. Adams's inability to shake these allegations crippled his presidency, fostering deep political divisions and undermining his reform agenda. The controversy not only eroded trust in his leadership, but also set the stage for Jacksonian populism to dominate the next era of American politics. We've seen corrupt presidents, racist presidents, and incompetent presidents, but this next one is so cruel that he caused the death of thousands just by passing a law. But before we discuss him, if you enjoyed this video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you can see more videos like this. As the seventh president of America, Andrew Jackson's presidency was defined by his ruthless enforcement of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a policy that forcibly displaced tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the Southeast. Ignoring legal and moral objections, Jackson pressured tribes like the Cherokee, Cree, and Choctaw into signing removal treaties, often through coercion and deception. The subsequent forced marches, most infamously the Trail of Tears in 1838, resulted in the deaths of thousands due to disease, starvation, and exposure. This genocidal policy, driven by Jackson's expansionist ambitions and racial prejudices, violated Supreme Court rulings and betrayed the nation's founding principles of justice. The Trail of Tears remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, a glaring testament to Jackson's authoritarianism and disregard for human rights. Jackson was unnecessarily bothered by the existence of Indians, but his successor was not bothered enough by the things that actually mattered. As the 8th President of America, Martin Van Buren's presidency was consumed by the devastating Panic of 1837, an economic collapse triggered by the reckless financial policies of his predecessor, Andrew Jackson. Yet rather than taking decisive action to alleviate widespread suffering, Van Buren clung to rigid laissez-faire ideology, refusing to intervene as banks failed, unemployment soared, and hunger spread. His most controversial decision, pushing for an independent treasury system, did little to address immediate hardships and instead prolonged the Depression. Despite a brief recovery in 1838, the recession persisted for nearly 7 years. Over 40% of all banks failed. Businesses closed, prices declined, and there was mass unemployment. Van Buren's aloofness and inability to connect with ordinary Americans earned him the nickname Martin Van Ruin, as his administration became synonymous with economic indifference. His failure to adapt to crisis conditions cemented his reputation as an ineffectual leader, contributing to his landslide defeat in the 1840 election. The 9th President of the United States of America, William Henry Harrison, often celebrated as a war hero, was ultimately responsible for leading brutal military campaigns against Native American tribes, including the violent confrontation at the Battle of Tippecanoe. As governor of the Indiana Territory and a U.S. military general, Harrison pursued an aggressive expansionist agenda, seeking to displace native communities and seize their lands for American settlements. The origins of the conflict stemmed from rising tensions between the U.S. government and the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who sought to unite tribes in resistance against further encroachment. In November 1811, Harrison marched a force of over 1,000 soldiers to Prophetstown, a Native American settlement near the Tippecanoe River, intending to provoke a confrontation. Despite claiming he sought only to negotiate, Harrison positioned his troops near the village overnight, anticipating an attack. When warriors from Tecumseh's Confederacy struck at dawn, Harrison's forces retaliated with overwhelming violence, burning Prophetstown to the ground and scattering its inhabitants. Though Harrison framed the battle as a defensive victory, it was a deliberate escalation in his campaign to weaken native resistance, resulting in long-lasting devastation for indigenous communities. The battle cemented Harrison's ruthless reputation as a military leader who prioritized American expansion over native sovereignty, setting the stage for further conflicts in the War of 1812. Harrison actively warred against the Indians, but his successor went against the very same party that supported him. The 10th President of America, John Tyler's tenure was defined by his dramatic betrayal of the Whig Party that had elected him, leading to his alienation from both political allies and opponents. After ascending to the presidency following William Henry Harrison's death in 1841, Tyler repeatedly vetoed key Whig legislation, including bills to re-establish a national bank. His obstinacy infuriated Whig leaders like Henry Clay, who had expected Tyler to follow their agenda. In retaliation, the Whigs expelled Tyler from the party, dubbing him his accidency, and making him the first president to face impeachment threats from his own former allies. His stubborn refusal to compromise not only crippled his administration, but also deepened political divisions, leaving a legacy of dysfunction and mistrust in the executive branch. And he wasn't the only president whose stubbornness put him into trouble. His successor stubbornly wanted more land and led America into yet another war. The 11th president, James K. Polk's aggressive expansionism led to one of the most controversial conflicts in U.S. history, the Mexican-American War. This was fueled by deliberate deception and manufactured pretexts. Polk, determined to acquire California and the Southwest, provoked Mexico by sending troops in disputed territory near the Rio Grande, knowing it would incite hostilities. When clashes erupted, he falsely claimed that Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil, using this as justification for war. Critics, including a young Abraham Lincoln, accused Polk of misleading Congress and the public to justify an unjust land grab. The war, which resulted in massive territorial gains, also intensified sectional tensions, setting the stage for future conflicts. Despite his negative approach to the situation, Polk added to America's landmass, and to some people he would have seemed like a competent leader and conqueror. His successor, however, was incompetent on all fronts with no prior political experience. Zachary Taylor was the 12th president, and his lack of political experience became a critical flaw as he struggled to navigate the escalating tensions over slavery in the late 1840s. As a career military officer with no prior government service, Taylor underestimated the complexities of sectional politics. His insistence on admitting California and New Mexico as free states, bypassing the usual territorial process, outraged Southern leaders and deepened the divide between North and South. His heavy-handed approach alienated key lawmakers, and his sudden death in 1850 left the nation without a clear leader during a pivotal moment. Had he lived, his inability to build consensus might have accelerated the nation's march towards civil war. Next up is a president who was eager to please and in the end strengthened the hold of slavery in America. Before we talk about Millard Fillmore's disastrous tenure, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. The 13th President of America, Millard Fillmore's greatest failure was his enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a morally reprehensible law that mandated the return of escaped slaves to their owners, even in free states. Fillmore, eager to appease Southern slaveholders, signed the bill as part of a compromise of 1850, believing it would preserve the Union. Instead, it inflamed Northern abolitionist sentiment, spurred violent resistance, and turned many moderates against slavery. His willingness to sacrifice human rights for political expediency tarnished his legacy, revealing a president more concerned with short-term stability than justice. And his successor? Wasn't any different. The 14th president, Franklin Pierce's blind allegiance to pro-slavery interests culminated in the catastrophic Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed slavery to expand into new territories. Pierce, seeking to appease Southern Democrats, endorsed the doctrine of popular sovereignty, igniting violent clashes between pro- and anti-slavery settlers in Bleeding, Kansas. His failure to intervene as chaos unfolded exposed his weak leadership and deepened national divisions. By empowering slaveholders, Pierce accelerated the country's descent towards civil war, leaving behind a legacy of bloodshed and broken unity. However, his successor added gasoline to the already roaring flames of the Civil War. The 15th president, James Buchanan's term was largely defined by his mishandling of the escalating secession crisis that ultimately led to the Civil War. As the nation fractured over the issue of slavery, Buchanan's actions and inactions failed to prevent the southern states from leaving the Union. Buchanan's failure to confront the secession crisis in the months before Abraham Lincoln's inauguration revealed his fatal indecisiveness and lack of leadership during one of the nation's most critical moments. As southern states began seceding following Lincoln's election in 1860, Buchanan, a Northern Democrat with Southern sympathies, refused to take decisive action, arguing that while secession was illegal, the federal government had no constitutional authority to stop it. His inaction emboldened secessionists, allowing the Confederacy to organize and fortify itself before the Civil War even began. His flawed handling of the crisis, including his refusal to reinforce federal forts in the South, left the Union weakened and unprepared, cementing his legacy as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. Lincoln, as his successor, tried to curtail things, but went about it in the wrong way. The 16th president of America was Abraham Lincoln, and while his term was defined by the abolition of slavery, he still had his flaws. His suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War, while arguably necessary to maintain Union stability, represented a severe overreach of executive power that undermined civil liberties. In 1861, Lincoln authorized the military to arrest and detain suspected Confederate sympathizers without trial, a move that bypassed judicial oversight and sparked outrage among critics who accused him of tyranny. The policy expanded as the war progressed, leading to the imprisonment of thousands, including newspaper editors and politicians who opposed his administration. Though the Supreme Court later ruled his actions unconstitutional in Ex parte Merryman, Lincoln ignored the decision, setting a dangerous precedent for wartime presidential authority that critics argued eroded democratic principles. And his successor only made things worse. The 17th president was Andrew Johnson, and his racist and combative approach to Reconstruction alienated Congress and sabotaged efforts to secure civil rights for freed slaves, leaving a devastating legacy for Black Americans. A Southern Democrat who remained loyal to the Union, Johnson clashed bitterly with radical Republicans, vetoing key legislation like the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. His leniency towards former Confederates allowed Southern states to enact oppressive black codes, effectively re-enslaving African Americans under a different system. His obstructionism led to his impeachment in 1868, though he narrowly avoided removal. Johnson's presidency prolonged racial injustice and set back progress for decades. After him was Ulysses Grant, whose administration saw corruption unlike any other before his tenure. The 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant's administration was marred by rampant corruption, as scandals like the Whiskey Ring and Credit Mobilier tarnished his presidency and undermined public trust in government. Though Grant himself was not personally corrupt, his loyalty to dishonest appointees and his inability to root out malfeasance allowed fraud to flourish. The Whiskey Ring, in which officials siphoned millions in tax revenue, reached into Grant's inner circle, while the Credit Mobilier scandal exposed bribery involving railroad contracts and high-ranking politicians. Grant's failure to effectively address these scandals damaged his reputation and reinforced the perception of the Gilded Age as an era of unchecked graft. After him was Rutherford Hayes, who had no regard for the civil rights of black people. The 19th president, Rutherford B. Hayes' controversial election in 1876, secured through the Compromise of 1877, effectively ended Reconstruction and abandoned black Southerners to white supremacist rule. In exchange for Southern Democratic support in the disputed election, Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, allowing former Confederates to violently suppress black voting rights and impose Jim Crow laws. While Hayes advocated for civil rights in principle, his political deal-making prioritized national unity over racial justice, enabling decades of systematic oppression. His presidency marked the tragic betrayal of African Americans who had briefly experienced freedom under federal protection. After him was James Garfield, who was unfortunately assassinated. James Garfield was the 20th president of the USA. His short-lived presidency was weakened by his entanglement in factional Republican patronage disputes, a system he had vowed to reform but ultimately could not escape. His assassination in 1881 by Charles Guiteau, a disgruntled office seeker, underscored the dangers of the spoils system, yet Garfield himself had previously engaged in patronage politics. His inability to fully distance himself from party machine politics before his death left his reformist ambitions unfulfilled, and his administration became a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of patronage. And if you've made it this far into the video, like and subscribe to support the channel. Chester A. Arthur, the 21st president's early political career was defined by his role as a loyalist to New York's corrupt Republican machine, where he profited from patronage as the state's customs collector before his presidency. Though he surprised critics by signing the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883, his past as a machine politician cast a long shadow over his integrity. His reluctance to fully embrace reform until pressured by public outrage revealed his deep-rooted ties to the very corruption he later sought to dismantle, leaving his legacy as one of reluctant and inconsistent progress. The revelation that Grover Cleveland, the 22nd and 24th president, had fathered an illegitimate child during his early political career became a major scandal that haunted his 1884 presidential campaign. Opponents mercilessly taunted him with the chant, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" a mocking reference to the child born out of wedlock. Cleveland, then a bachelor, admitted to supporting the child financially but refused further comment, framing it as a private matter. Critics seized on the scandal to question his moral character, while his supporters dismissed it as irrelevant to his political capabilities. The controversy nearly derailed his bid for the presidency, exposing the era's intense scrutiny of personal conduct in public office. Though Cleveland ultimately won the election, the scandal lingered as a stain on his reputation, demonstrating how personal indiscretion could overshadow policy achievements in the court of public opinion. The Billion-Dollar Congress of 1890, which operated under the 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison's administration, became synonymous with reckless spending and political favoritism, tarnishing his presidency. Republicans, emboldened by their control of both legislative branches, passed extravagant pension bills for Civil War veterans, inflated tariffs to benefit industrialists, and lavished funds on pork barrel projects. The resulting budget surplus evaporated, replaced by a staggering deficit that outraged taxpayers. Critics lambasted lambasted Harrison for failing to curb the excesses of his party, and the public backlash was swift. Republicans suffered devastating losses in the 1890 midterms. Harrison's inability to restrain congressional profligacy reinforced perceptions of his weak leadership and contributed to his defeat in the 1892 election. The episode underscored the dangers of unchecked partisanship and fiscal irresponsibility in government. As the 25th President of America, William McKinley's decision to annex the Philippines following the Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a dark chapter in his term, as it led to a brutal and controversial occupation. Claiming a divine mandate to civilize the islands, McKinley authorized military force to suppress Filipino independence fighters, igniting a bloody 3-year conflict. American troops embodied scorched earth tactics, internment camps, and widespread violence against civilians, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths. Critics, including anti-imperialists like Mark Twain, condemned the war as a betrayal of American democratic ideals. McKinley's expansionist policies exposed the hypocrisy of promoting freedom abroad while denying it to conquered peoples. The conflict strained U.S. moral and resources, leaving a legacy of resentment in the Philippines and raising enduring questions about the ethics of American imperialism. The Brownsville Affair of 1806 revealed Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president's troubling willingness to prioritize political expediency over racial justice, marring his progressive legacy. After unsubstantiated claims that black soldiers had shot at white townspeople in Brownsville, Texas, Roosevelt dishonorably discharged all 167 men of the 25th Infantry Regiment without a trial, denying them due process. Despite conflicting evidence and protests from civil rights leaders, Roosevelt refused to reconsider, fearing backlash from Southern voters. The decision devastated the careers and reputations of the accused soldiers, many of whom had served with distinction. Only decades later were they posthumously exonerated. The incident exposed Roosevelt's racial biases and willingness to sacrifice fairness for political gain, undermining his image as a champion of equality. The Ballinger-Pinchot controversy of 1910 exposed William Howard Taft, the 27th president's poor judgment in handling conservation policy, fracturing his administration and alienating progressive allies. When Interior Secretary Richard Ballinger was accused of improperly selling public lands to corporate interests, Gifford Pinchot, head of the Forest Service, publicly condemned him. Taft, seeking to avoid scandal, sided with Ballinger and fired Pinchot, a move that enraged conversationalists, including Theodore Roosevelt. The scandal painted Taft as a pawn of big business and eroded trust in his leadership. Roosevelt's subsequent third-party challenge in 1912 split the Republican vote, ensuring Taft's humiliating defeat. The affair highlighted Taft's inability to navigate political conflicts, cementing his reputation as an ineffective president. The 28th president, Woodrow Wilson's administration, oversaw one of the most egregious violations of civil liberties in U.S. history with the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918, which criminalized dissent during World War I. Under these laws, thousands of anti-war activists, socialists, and immigrants were imprisoned for merely criticizing the government. Journalists were fined, publications censored, and political opponents like Eugene Debs jailed for speeches. Wilson, despite his scholarly background, endorsed this suppression, framing it as wartime necessity. The crackdown fostered a climate of fear and paranoia, with vigilante mobs attacking perceived disloyalty. Post-war, the laws were widely condemned as unconstitutional overreach, tarnishing Wilson's legacy as a defender of democracy. His willingness to sacrifice free speech for security set a dangerous precedent for future wartime repression. Warren Harding was the 29th President of America. The Teapot Dome scandal of 1921 to 1923 became the defining symbol of his corrupt administration, revealing systematic graft among his closest advisors. Interior Secretary Albert Fall secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes, including cash and livestock. When the scheme unraveled, Fall became the first cabinet member imprisoned for crimes committed in office. Harding, though not directly implicated, faced accusations of negligence for appointing such unscrupulous allies. The scandal epitomized the cronyism and lax oversight of his presidency, fueling public disillusionment with government integrity. Harding's death in 1923 spared him from full accountability, but Teapot Dome endured as a byword for political corruption in the Roaring '20s. The 30th president, Calvin Coolidge's rigid adherence to laissez-faire economics and limited government intervention during the 1920s exacerbated the underlying weaknesses that led to the Great Depression. His administration's refusal to regulate speculative speculative banking practices, coupled with deep tax cuts for the wealthy, created an unstable financial bubble. While his hands-off approach aligned with Republican orthodoxy, his failures to address agricultural distress, labor unrest, or wealth inequality left the economy vulnerable. The stock market crash of 1929, just months after he left office, was in part a consequence of his passive governance. Coolidge's belief that the chief business of the American people is business blinded him to the need for structural reforms, leaving his successor, Herbert Hoover, to inherit a crisis he was ill-equipped to manage. Before we get into that though, like this video and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more. The 31st president, Herbert Hoover's dogged commitment to voluntarism and limited federal action in response to the Great Depression deepened the nation's economic collapse. Despite mounting unemployment and bank failures, he resisted large-scale direct relief, relying instead on private charities and local governments, an approach that proved catastrophically inadequate. His signing of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which triggered retaliatory trade barriers worldwide, worsened global economic stagnation. Hoover's belief in rugged individualism, while philosophically consistent, rendered him tone-deaf to suffering. His infamous use of military force against the Bonus Army of 1932 symbolized his administration's detachment from public despair. His policies prolonged the Depression, leaving Franklin D. Roosevelt to implement the drastic interventions Hoover had refused. FDR was the 32nd president, and his most glaring flaw was his disastrous 1937 attempt to balance the budget prematurely, which plunged the recovering economy back into recession. Fearful of rising deficits, he slashed New Deal spending and tightened monetary policy, undoing years of progress. Unemployment surged again, exposing the fragility of recovery and forcing him to reverse course. Additionally, his court-packed scheme, an effort to expand the Supreme Court after it struck down key New Deal programs, damaged his credibility and revealed an alarming willingness to undermine judicial independence for political gain. While his leadership during World War II was transformative, his earlier economic miscalculation and power consolidation efforts tarnished his legacy as a pragmatic reformer. Harry Truman, the 33rd president, authorized the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and it remains one of the most morally contentious acts in presidential history. While he justified it as necessary to end World War II swiftly, critics argue Japan was already nearing surrender, and the bombings, which killed over 200,000 civilians, set a dangerous precedent for nuclear warfare. His administration's escalation of Cold War tensions through the Truman Doctrine and McCarthy-era loyalty purges also fueled anti-communist paranoia, stifling dissent and legitimizing witch hunts. Though he championed the Marshall Plan, his reliance on militarized containment entrenched global divisions and sowed the seeds for future conflicts like Korea. Eisenhower, the 34th president, was reliant on covert CIA operations to overthrow foreign governments, such as Iran's Mossadegh and Guatemala's Arbenz, prioritized short-term anti-communist victories over long-term stability. These coups installed repressive regimes, breeding anti-American resentment that backfired for decades. Domestically, his reluctance to aggressively enforce civil rights, despite sending troops to Little Rock, allowed segregationist resistance to fester. His warnings about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address rang hollow, given his own expansion of defense spending and nuclear brinkmanship. While his presidency projected stability, his foreign interventions and passive stance on racial justice left enduring scars. As the 35th president of the USA, John F. Kennedy's disastrous handling of the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 revealed his inexperience and poor judgment. Despite warnings from military advisors, he greenlit the CIA's poorly planned coup attempt against Castro, then withdrew critical air support at the last moment, ensuring its humiliating failure. The fiasco emboldened Soviet Premier Khrushchev, leading directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Additionally, JFK's hesitant approach to civil rights, delaying federal action until 1963, frustrated activists like MLK, who criticized his caution as political cowardice. His charismatic leadership could not mask these early missteps, which risked nuclear war and delayed racial progress. LBJ was the 36th president, and his flaw was his escalation of the Vietnam War, a conflict he privately doubted but publicly championed due to fears of appearing weak on communism. Despite intelligence suggesting military intervention was unwinnable, he deployed hundreds of thousands of troops and intensified bombing campaigns, leading to over 58,000 American deaths and millions of Vietnamese casualties. His deceitful portrayal of the Gulf of Tonkin incident as unprovoked aggression exposed a willingness to manipulate Congress and the public. While his domestic achievements, Civil Rights Act and Great Society, were monumental, Vietnam overshadowed them, fracturing the Democratic Party and eroding national trust in government. The 37th President Nixon's paranoia and authoritarian impulses culminated in the Watergate scandal, which defined his presidency as one of corruption and criminality. His creation of the Plumbers Unit to sabotage political opponents, illegal surveillance of journalists, and direct involvement in covering up the break-in revealed a contempt for democracy. Beyond Watergate, his secret bombing of Cambodia, conducted without congressional approval, prolonged the Vietnam War deceitfully, causing untold civilian suffering. Though he achieved diplomatic breakthroughs with China and Entente, his abuse of power permanently damaged public faith in the presidency, leading to his historic resignation. The 38th President Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon undermined public trust in the presidency and fueled perceptions of a political cover-up, damaging Ford's credibility from the outset of his administration. The decision, while intended to heal a nation fractured by Watergate, was widely seen as an act of cronyism that shielded Nixon from accountability, reinforcing skepticism toward government transparency. Critics argued that Ford, as an unelected president, lacked the mandate to absolve his predecessor so swiftly, and the move likely cost him the 1976 election, as voters interpreted it as a betrayal of democratic principles. The 39th President of America, Jimmy Carter's handling of the Iran hostage crisis exposed critical weaknesses in his foreign policy leadership, culminating in a prolonged diplomatic stalemate and a failed rescue mission. Carter's indecisiveness and reliance on negotiations allowed the crisis to stretch for 444 days, emboldening Iran's revolutionary regime and humiliating the US on the global stage. The botched Operation Eagle Claw, which ended in a deadly desert collision, further highlighted poor planning and operational incompetence, cementing Carter's image as an ineffectual commander-in-chief during emergencies. After him was Reagan, whose administration was instrumental in the Iran-Contra affair and not in a good way. The 40th President, Ronald Reagan's Iran-Contra affair revealed a blatant disregard for congressional authority and the rule of law, as his administration secretly sold arms to Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism, to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. The covert scheme violated US policy and led to multiple indictments, tarnishing Reagan's legacy with a scandal that echoed the worst excesses of executive overreach. Though Reagan denied direct involvement, his lax oversight fostered a culture of recklessness among aides, undermining his reputation as a stalwart of constitutional governments. Next up is George H.W. Bush. As the 41st President of America, George A.W. Bush's failure to address the 1991 recession decisively alienated working-class voters and contributed to his re-election defeat. Despite his foreign policy successes, Bush's detached response to economic hardship, including his infamous broken pledge, "Read my lips, no new taxes," eroded public confidence. His administration appeared out of touch with domestic struggles, allowing Bill Clinton to capitalize on economic anxiety with a more populist message. From this point, we are going to be discussing past and present presidents who are still alive and facing backlash for the things they did while they were in the White House. History never forgets, and you also shouldn't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you've made it this far. Next up is Bill Clinton, who was impeached after lying about his affair with a barely legal intern at the White House, who was less than half his age. In his time as the 42nd president, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, initially dismissed as political mudslinging, was ultimately confirmed as a serious breach of presidential conduct, leading to Clinton's impeachment for perjury and obstruction of justice. The scandal erupted in 1998 when it was revealed that Clinton had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with White House intern, then 21-year-old Monica Lewinsky, and later lied under oath about it during a sworn deposition in the Paula Jones sexual harassment case. Despite his initial public denials, famously declaring, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," Clinton later admitted to the affair after DNA evidence and Lewinsky's testimony exposed his deception. The House of Representatives impeached him on charges of perjury and obstruction, though the Senate acquitted him, allowing him to remain in office. The scandal severely damaged Clinton's legacy, overshadowing his policy achievements and cementing his reputation for personal misconducts. For Hillary Clinton, the ordeal was both politically and personally devastating, forcing her to publicly defend her husband while privately grappling with his infidelity. Though she emerged as a sympathetic figure, the scandal cast a long shadow over her own political career, fueling perceptions of the Clintons as ethically compromised. The close of the Clinton years, despite its controversies, 1990s marked a period of relative peace and economic growth. However, the subsequent election of George W. Bush came with a different set of problems, significantly the terrible response to Hurricane Katrina. George W. Bush was the 43rd president, and the federal response to Hurricane Katrina, widely condemned as a catastrophic failure, exposed severe shortcomings in his administration's preparedness and leadership. The storm, which devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast in August 2005, overwhelmed local and state authorities, but the federal government's delayed and disorganized reactions increased the crisis. Bush, who initially praised FEMA's efforts, was later forced to acknowledge systematic failures after images of stranded survivors and chaotic evacuations dominated global media. Critics highlighted his administration's slow deployment of National Guard troops, inadequate coordination with local officials, and the appointment of unqualified political loyalists to disaster management roles, such as FEMA Director Michael Brown. A White House-commissioned report later admitted that the government's actions were unacceptable, citing bureaucratic inertia and poor communication. The Guardian reported that Bush's detached initial response, including his decision to remain on vacation as the storm approached, fueled public outrage, while NPR noted his eventual admission of responsibility for the failures. The disaster became a defining symbol of governmental incompetence, permanently tarnishing Bush's legacy and revealing deep flaws in America's emergency response systems. His successor Obama would go on to make promises he couldn't keep and damage the already fragile health system of America. The 44th president, Barack Obama's Affordable Care Act, or ACA, once hailed as a transformative solution to America's healthcare crisis, ultimately fell short of its promises, leaving a legacy of broken commitments and financial strain. The program, signed into law in 2010, aimed to expand coverage, lower costs, and allow Americans to keep their preferred health plans, pledges that largely went unfulfilled. The origins of these failures can be traced back to the law's flawed design, which led to over 7 million insurance policy cancellations, despite Obama's repeated assurances that, if you like your plan, you can keep it. Premiums and deductibles skyrocketed, burdening middle-class families, while the expansion of Medicaid strained state budgets. The ACA also added hundreds of billions to the national debt, contradicting Obama's promise that the law would be deficit neutral. Investigations revealed that the administration had knowingly misled the public about the plan's feasibility, with internal documents later confirming that officials anticipated many of the disruptions. By the end of Obama's presidency, the ACA had become a contentious symbol of government overreach. Its once grand ambitions reduced to a question mark over its long-term viability. Obama's tenure was a mix of good and bad decisions, but his successor, Donald Trump, was even messier. But since he's currently the President of the United States of America, we'll discuss him last and move on to Joe Biden. As the 46th President of the USA, Joe Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, initially framed as a necessary end to America's longest war, quickly descended into chaos, undermining his leadership and straining alliances. The hurried evacuation, marked by the Taliban's rapid takeover of Kabul in August 2021, left thousands of Afghan allies stranded and exposed glaring failures in planning and execution. The administration underestimated the speed of the Taliban's advance, leading to a frantic airlift operation that saw desperate Afghans clinging to US aircraft. It was reported that NATO allies, blindsided by the disorganized pullout, criticized the lack of coordination, with some forced to conduct their own evacuations under dangerous conditions. Former generals blamed the Biden administration for inadequate preparation, which contributed to the collapse of the Afghan government and military. The situation severely damaged Biden's image as a competent commander-in-chief, overshadowing his earlier successes. The scenes of chaos in Kabul, including a deadly ISIS-K attack at the airport, became emblematic of a poorly managed exit, eroding trust among allies and fueling domestic criticism of his presidency. Lastly, we'll be discussing Donald Trump, a man who was voted as the worst president America has ever had, worse than the ones who began the Civil War or worsened its aftermath. His list of controversies is a mile long, but we'll only focus on one major one. After his term as the 45th President of the United States of America, Trump ran for president again. But when he lost, he lashed out in the worst way possible. The January 6 Capitol riot, initially downplayed by some as a protest gone awry, was later revealed to be a direct result of Donald Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election. The attack, which unfolded as Congress certified Joe Biden's victory, was fueled by Trump's repeated false claims of election fraud and his incendiary speech, urging supporters to fight like hell. According to investigations, Trump's actions that day amounted to one of the worst abuses of presidential powers in US history, as he encouraged a violent mob to storm the Capitol, leading to 5 deaths and widespread destruction. The fallout was immediate. Trump's image, already polarizing, suffered irreparable damage among moderates and institutionalists, with even some Republican allies condemning his role in the insurrection. For the American public, the event deepened political divisions, eroding trust in democratic institutions and sparking fear of further violence. Federal prosecutors later indicted Trump for obstruction of the election certification, marking an unprecedented legal reckoning for a former president. The January 6 riot not only tarnished Trump's legacy, but also left a lasting scar on the nation's political landscape, exposing the fragility of democratic norms in the face of political manipulation. To prove a baseless point, he incited a riot that claimed the lives of 5 people and injured others, including law enforcement officials who tried to stop rioters. In recent times, Trump's second term as the 47th President of America, or rather his revenge term, has been marked with several controversial decisions, including but not limited to presidential pardons for those convicted of crimes related to the January 6th Capitol attack. Other major decisions include the implementation of significant tariffs, leading to international trade tensions, the creation of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, led by Elon Musk, tasked with cutting spending within the federal government. Right now, we can't really comment on how this would affect America in the long run, but the whole world has their eyes on Donald Trump, waiting to see how everything will unfold. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, turn on your notifications, and I'll see you in the next video about every genocide explained.